Welcome to Aarhus BSS. It's a great pleasure of having you visit our institution, and it's fantastic to learn some new stuff of your recent research and your new diagnosis. You tell us that Europe is a sick country, a sick region. Is it really as serious as your talk suggests?
Well, that's what the economic statistics suggest, that every decade we lose about 1.5% of our long-term economic growth, and the way we are going next decade, we are not going to have growth at all. So the question is, can we do something so that we are out of that, or is it so deterministic, so basically no growth decade?
So think about that Europe has this growth challenge. Why doesn't the old medicine work anymore? Why don't we just have expansionary fiscal policies, the lax monetary policy? What is your analysis? Why doesn't it work?
Well, because the rest of the world has changed, and while 20, 30 years ago we didn't have the competition from Asia, other than Japan, now we have as our main competitor often either China or Korea or Malaysia in a number of industries, and then we have America on the other side. So Europe is increasingly squeezed between these two large competitors. And then standard policies that worked in the 60s, in the 70s, in the 80s somehow have to be changed or supplemented with other policies, both to create a larger market at home but also abroad.
So if integration still is part of the remedy of igniting growth again in Europe, how can we have any deeper integration? I mean, haven't we completed all the potential that Europe has? Or where do you see new opportunities for deeper integration in Europe?
Most people assume that we have completed product market, at least integration, and that's not true. So while we can ship goods, manufacturing goods across Europe, that's not the case for banking products, that's not the case for, in general, financial products. We don't have a single capital markets. It's not true in energy, which is 10-15% of GDP in most of our countries. We don't have a single energy market, and we certainly don't have a single digital market. So just these three markets, between them, account for more than half of Europe's GDP, and they're not integrated.
So if I think of the Danish economy, energy, we have quite some spearhead companies, digital, at least in the Scandinavian area, you're quite advanced. So do you think that the solution to Europe, in a sense, is to imitate the Scandinavian model?
To imitate and just make sure that it's spread around Europe, because yes, Denmark has, or Scandinavia in general has, for example, very good high-tech internet, logistics and so on companies. But since the market is quite subdivided across Europe, there is no single digital market. They cannot penetrate, Italy and Spain and Germany and Poland and so on. So very good companies operate on a very small market. Languages, I should say, also play a big role here. That you can have a great company, and if I cannot read what it says, well.
I noticed in your forthcoming book you use a lot of examples from Europe in order to derive what solutions can be implemented. But is it, in your experience, is it legitimate to take a policy that worked in Estonia and claim I can just implant it into, let's say, the German economy or the European economy at large? Or is there something one would have to take care of to take a policy tool that worked in a small country with, 1.3 million people, and then scale it up to 500 million people?
Well, I've worked in policy making now for nearly 20 years, and what I've seen is that it's a lot easier to give an example from the region than saying, let's say like Korea, or let's be like the US, and then you immediately come up with culturally very different, society operates in very different ways. Well, if you bring examples from Europe, eventually you'll get to the size whether a small country can teach something a large country and the other way around. But at least culture, most people agree, is very, very similar. Not identical, but very similar. So you cannot say, well, Europeans are not going to do what Americans do.
When I look at some of your data, a lot of it basically gives you a bad mood because it looks quite bleak for Europe, and we have issues, and the well-known rehearsed issues on productivity, but also sort of the amount of new companies that are created in Europe, the performance of our higher education systems, and that all sums up then to the slack in growth. Is this a realistic account, or are you a pessimist when it comes to European growth prospects?
I'm not a pessimist, otherwise I would not be writing suggestions on how to improve. It's good to have the basic facts in order. Because sometimes we think of Europe being Europeans, things that are not true. For example, if you ask most Europeans, they'll say we have excellent education. Well, it's in most countries it is the case, but in some it's not. Or people would say we have great universities. We have in some countries, in most countries we don't. So this is something to work on. So you uncover some of the problems more fundamentally, and then you can find at least some of the solutions.
So if you think about some of the big growth spurts we have seen in Asia, let's say that you liberalize markets, you internationalize markets, or you simply transform from an agricultural society to an industrial society, that's when we see these huge growth figures. Couldn't one argue that Europe has just harvested all these possibilities and that's the end of the story, and now we have a new trend growth and that's just flat?
Well, many people do argue this under the topic of secular stagnation. We've reached a certain level and basically that's it. We're going to be happy to keep that level. And in history, certainly you've seen many societies maintain a certain level for many, many decades. I think Europe still is a magnet to many people from around the world and many technologies from around the world. So the question is, if we don't want to stagnate, we somehow have to figure out how to integrate these people and these ideas into our markets to continue growing, and I believe that's possible. This is why I still do this research.
I saw one of the strongest recommendations I heard from your research is the prospect of a digital market integration in Europe. Can you just explain to us again, why is that where you see the biggest potential? I think it's a fairly new argument, and you documented this huge difference to the US. So why do you exactly pinpoint the digital integration?
Because it's a relatively new regulation, so there isn't yet a large established lobby that would argue against that. It's not a sector that's been around for even 20 years in most cases. So it should be relatively straightforward both for politicians and for regulators to agree that on common rules. And once you do agree on common rules, you essentially expand from a small market like Denmark or Bulgaria to really a market of 500 million. You'd have to deal with language barriers, but fortunately there is enough technology to make that very easily available. Currently, very, very good companies, very European companies, and in the book we record a number of them, start very well in their country, get to a certain size, and then they cannot really grow. American companies buy them out, bring the idea to the US, and they have 400 million customers.
Okay. Your idea is we could imitate it in Europe and sort of tap into that potential.
And there isn't really that many yet vested interests that would make it difficult. Well, for example, I also believe that if we have a single capital market, that would help Europe.
Yeah, but there would be a lot of existing established banks.
But very, French banks, Italian insurers are not very excited to have.
But then in some, you're arguing that the barriers to growth in Europe are actually man-made or politics-made even to some extent.
The vast majority of barriers are exactly made by European politicians, and other politicians argue, okay, it's easy to remove them, but they don't know enough. So somehow we need to have a breakthrough in at least some of these areas.
That's a sharp analysis, and I fear you're right. So we can do all the economics we want. If we don't understand the politics, it doesn't ignite growth in Europe.
Precisely.
Yeah. Thank you very much for coming to Aarhus and enlighten us with your research and your ideas about European growth.
Thank you very much.